Hello, eighth grade. This is Mrs. Politsky, and I have your notes for chapter 16. And we're going to talk about how the United States was moving towards the Civil War. And more specifically, in section 1, we're going to talk about some of the compromises that were made kind of during this era of time, some of which were probably pretty bad compromises because it kind of brought us closer to the Civil War. So we're going to start with this fella that we see down in the bottom left-hand corners, Stephen A. Douglas, who was a U.S. Senator from the state of Illinois. He was a Democrat. Matter of fact, he, at one point in time, is going to run for president. And he's also obviously going to find himself kind of butting heads with Abraham Lincoln, but we'll get to that. In this era of the early 1850s, he was very concerned about some of the compromises that were being made, particularly what had happened after California had joined the Union. And he took charge of some of this. We have our Compromise of 1850, and through that, one of the things that's going to come out of this is the Fugitive Slave Act. And through his kind of leadership or his involvement, we're going to see a few things happening within this plan. And that's kind of what we're going to spell out here in number 2. California is going to be able to enter the Union as a free state. If you know anything about kind of the locality of California, there's a good chunk of that that's kind of south of the Mason-Dixon line and technically under the Compromise of 1820 or the Missouri Compromise. That should all have been probably slave territory. Instead, it's going to be free, but other new territories would have no limits on slavery. Okay, the slave trade, but not slavery, would be illegal in Washington, D.C. So if you were a person who lived, either in Virginia or Maryland, kind of in that vicinity, you wouldn't be able to go buy slaves, but you would be able to keep your slaves that you already have. There would be a stronger Fugitive Slave Act, and this is going to be requiring that all citizens had to help in catching runaway slaves. This part is a little bit more of a challenge because if a slave owner was pursuing a runaway slave, and let's say the slave was in a state like New York, New Yorkers who might be favoring abolition would be required to go and search for that slave and help turn them over. Otherwise, they would be breaking the law. So, free African Americans and whites formed the Underground Railroad, which we have talked about. And this was a network that helped runaway slaves escape slavery. If you take a look at the map, the lines that are in red, these are routes that were used during this period of time. Many saw that the Fugitive Slave Act was being unfair because it provided that the word of someone claiming to be a slaveholder proved the identity of a runaway slave, and an accused would really have no right to testify on his or her own defense if they would go into a court. In other words, they had no rights. And this is going to be kind of flushed out when we talk about the Supreme Court. But this is another map of the routes of the Underground Railroad. The areas there where the arrows or the lines are a little heavier, that is kind of by volume, the number of people that were following the routes. If you look at the Mississippi River Valley and the Ohio River Valley, there's that's kind of like I guess you could say a freeway as far as individuals leaving slave territories. Note that there were slaves in Texas that were heading towards Mexico and slaves that were in parts of the Americas heading towards Canada. Democratic candidate and President Franklin Pierce, who you see pictured below, became president in 1853 with the intention of enforcing this Fugitive Slave Act. In 1854, Senator Stephen A. Douglas of Illinois proposed organization of the region west of the Missouri River, and this at that time the state of Iowa, as the territories of Kansas and Nebraska, to encourage settlement in the West and to open way for the possibility of a transcontinental railroad. Note how big this territory is. If you look at Kansas, it's obviously bigger than what the real borders of Kansas are today. And if you look at Nebraska, there's parts of Nebraska that go into South Dakota and North Dakota and parts of Montana and Wyoming. So it's kind of an interesting territory here. The whole idea was to get people to move here, and to do this, he came up with this idea proposing getting rid of abandoning the Missouri Compromise, because he knew that Southerners would have objected to that, and having Kansas and Nebraska become free states, giving the North an advantage. He knew that they didn't like that, so he decided to use this idea that kind of goes back to our constitutional convention called popular sovereignty, which is kind of like majority rule. And this would allow settlers in a territory to vote on whether or not they would allow slavery by the sheer number of people that were actually living there. Congress passed the Kansas-Nebraska Act in May of 1854, and what we're going to have is a rush of people coming into the territory of Kansas primarily. And a lot of these people that were coming into Kansas were actually neighbors from Missouri. Missouri being a slave state, some of these people being slaveholders, they crossed the border. Sometimes they were kind of labeled as border ruffians because they were kind of thugs. And what they did is they just kind of came in and staked territory so that they could make Kansas a slave state. Okay? You got a political cartoon there, our political snake charmer, the man that's kind of in the middle with all the snakes on him, that's supposed to be Stephen Douglas. And obviously the snakes, these are some of the bad things that are happening with slavery and just kind of the corruption that is happening at this moment. So thousands of armed pro-slavery supporters called border ruffians, they came from Missouri to vote in Kansas elections. In 1855, a pro-slavery legislature in Kansas was elected in the little itty-bitty town of Lecompton, which is not very far from Lawrence, Kansas. So if you know where the University of Kansas is, the Jayhawks, Lecompton is probably just maybe 5 miles outside of Lawrence. And the town itself is very, very small. It's probably comparable to maybe Creston or Tarnoff as far as size is concerned. Okay, but only about 1,500 people, voters, lived in the entire state of Kansas at this moment in time. And there were 6,000 people that voted for the Lecompton Compromise or Lecompton Constitution. So a lot of people are questioning, the validity of this election because it seems very corrupt just because of the numbers. But for a time, Kansas became a slave territory. And as a result of that, we're going to have some abolitionists that are going to move in. In May of 1856, there was an uprising with the support of slaves, and they attacked the town of Lawrence, an anti-slavery stronghold, and anti-slavery forces retaliated. And what's going to end up happening is the rise of John Brown, who you see photographed kind of down at the bottom. John Brown was an abolitionist, had a big family. They came from back east. They had moved to Kansas after the Kansas-Nebraska Act was kind of signed in. And they decided that they were going to fight slavery, but to do it by force. And so John Brown and his sons lead an attack on the Pottawatomie Creek, which is kind of in that vicinity of Lawrence, Kansas. And at that point in time, John Brown and his followers, they kill 5 supporters of slavery. And John Brown kind of gets kind of a reputation of being, a cold-blooded murderer, and at times he's finding himself having to uh, kind of be hidden away. And matter of fact, there's a story that he followed kind of the passage of the Underground Railroad through parts of southeast Nebraska and across the river into Iowa, and made a few speeches, once he got into Iowa, being a free state, to say how much he was willing to fight for this. But John Brown in the South became a very hated man by the slaveholders because they saw him as being kind of a zealot and kind of crazy. Hence, I want to talk about this painting. It's called The Tragic Prelude, and it was painted by a man named John Stuart Curry. And actually, it's a mural. It was painted in 1942 or finished in 1942, and it's actually today, you can find it in the state capitol in Topeka, Kansas. The size of this thing is pretty big. If you can envision the wall in my room where my whiteboard is, it pretty much covers the whole north side of my wall. If you would look at this, in reality, if like you saw it face to face. There were some people in Kansas when this thing was unveiled in the 40s that were just disgusted. They hated it. Part of it being the fact that, it's got the guy in the middle. And the guy in the middle is actually John Brown. If you take kind of a look at the image, number one, he's got the big beard. And later in life, John Brown is going to be sporting that look. Kind of looks like one of the guys from Duck Dynasty. He also has his gun in one hand, and if you look at the other hand, he's got a Bible. It has the Alpha and Omega that's there. And if you look further down, you can see an American flag, and you can see what kind of looks like the Confederacy, a flag from, the South. You might see some individuals that are in uniform. If you look down at the very bottom, the men that are kind of laying at the feet of John Brown, you got one that's kind of in the blue and another that's in the gray. And in the background, you've got a prairie fire, you got a tornado, which is, kind of typical, I guess, for Kansas. But there were people that hated this thing. There were some people that really enjoyed it. Matter of fact, if you're a fan of classic rock, there's a band called Kansas. This is actually was used as artwork for an album cover that they did back in the 70s. But it is a controversial piece of work because of the fact that it's showing how divided our nation was. And in a sense, Kansas was like, the pre-Civil War. And we had kind of a lot of battles that were fought in Kansas and maybe right along the border into Kansas City and little parts of Missouri. In a sense, this was the warm-up, the pre-show, before the major event. So, newspapers, they called this whole turmoil Bleeding Kansas because there were so many people that were killed. By October of 1856, federal troops had arrived to stop the bloodshed. But there were still divisions, and these divisions are going to be pretty obvious as we kind of get into the war years, because you're going to find neighbors joining up with different forces based on their beliefs. In Congress, this actually became kind of bloody. There's an incident known as the Brooks-Summers incident, in which Preston Brooks, a member of the House of Representatives, repeatedly struck Senator Charles Sumner from Massachusetts over the head and shoulders with a cane. And so you can kind of see the little cartoon there of that happening. Today we just think Congress just debates. Back in the old days, they actually threw punches and hit each other with sharp things. But that's kind of how divided our nation was. We were on the verge of something crazy. So, thank you very much.